Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about making our communication skills more effective. My guest today is Dr. Herb Glazeroff. Dr. Glazeroff is a clinical psychologist and he also teaches courses in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Welcome, Herb, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dave.
Well, Herb, we talk about communication all the time. In fact, we're communicating right now. People talk all day long, but sometimes it's not always the most effective kind of communication. How do we know, what's the standard to know whether our communication is effective or not?
Good question. Effective communication actually is a very simple answer, but it's very complex. Effective communication is when the message sent is received accurately.
Okay, and so as far as receiving the communication or receiving that communication accurately, what's more important? Is it more important to get you to agree with what I'm saying and my point of view, or is it more important to have clarity in the situation?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, really. If you're just trying to get me to agree with you, we're probably not going to have an effective communication, because I'm part of the communication and I'm going to introduce my elements and not just want to be led by yours. So clarity always is very, very important. Clarity is achieved by getting feedback from the receiver of the message. So there's these different elements, one being the message sent and the message received. So the sender of the message is a very complex organism because we have our own history we bring with us. And then the receiver of the message, same thing. Very complex organism, bringing our own preferences, filters, expectations. So it's really hard to just tell somebody something, get them to agree with your point. Clarity is really important if you're going to have effective communication. You have to know what you're agreeing to. So you need to be clear about it.
So clarity is always a good thing, always appropriate, and always something we strive for. If we're trying to persuade someone, I guess that's on a different level. But the clarity is where we have to begin, at least.
Absolutely, very important.
Okay, well, let's talk about the overall aspect of communication, because as you know, and I know you're going to tell me this, that most of communication is not verbal. It's more about body gestures, what we call body language, tone, the way I'm perceived, my attitude, and so forth. What about that? How much of communication is really what's spoken verbally, and how much is those other indicators of body language?
Yeah, great question, and something that most people don't consider when they're talking with another person. Depending on whose research you read, I would say the estimate that's generally accepted is that 35% of a message that's received is verbal, 65% is nonverbal.
So about 2/3.
So yeah, and the interesting thing is the brain actually processes verbal cues and nonverbal cues in different parts of the brain. So if you're giving me a verbal message that says how interested you are in something while you're looking away and fiddling, I'm going to go, well, wait, is he really interested, or is he making believe he's interested? Because his nonverbal communication or language or signs and symbols say he's not really interested. So in our brain, the receiver's brain, they're going to have to somehow make those two sets of information come together. So if they're very diverse, you're not going to have an effective communication. If they're close, they might kind of say, yeah, this guy's meaning what he's saying. If the nonverbal overrides the verbal, you're going to have a problem getting your communication to be effective.
So obviously, if we want to be effective, we need to align our body posture or our body language with our verbal language.
Exactly, sure.
Okay, well, let's talk about email and social media, because so much of that doesn't involve having face-to-face contact. How do we perceive that communication differently?
I think that's one of the major, it's sort of a, in a way, a political statement. It's a major issue in today's culture. And as you mentioned, I teach classes at Ollie, and you have to be a senior to attend those. So one of the biggest complaints and problems and frustrations that the students have is, I can't communicate with my grandkids. I'm having trouble even communicating with my own kids, which is just that one generation down. But there's a lack of the nonverbal communication when you're texting. Mm-hmm. So there's no ability to know what's actually going on in the sender of the message, because all you're getting is words on a screen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a major problem in our society these days. And in fact, it's interesting to me that high schools are now offering a class where you sit face to face and talk to each other. And the students are having a real hard time in the beginning doing that, but then they kind of like it. I don't know if that's going to change the behavior, but the findings of the research is that they actually like sitting face to face and talking.
Who would have thought that technology would lead us to a point where face-to-face communication is a lost art?
Exactly, right?
Exactly, yeah, interesting phenomenon. All right, well, let's move ahead, and let's say that we're back to the face-to-face communication, and I have something I need to share with someone who I don't think is going to be very receptive, but it's still important to share that information. And I don't want that person, the receiver, I don't want them to put up the barriers immediately. Mm-hmm. So how do I approach that in a way that at least I break through the initial communication aspect of it and get the message out? And if they react, they react, but at least I want to get that message out. How do we do that?
Okay, so again, it's a very complex, because human beings are very complex. Mm-hmm. But one way to do that, Dave, is you provide a bigger picture for the person you're communicating with. And if you want them to buy into what you're saying, you start with some bigger picture elements. And these are things that you might have in common. Plus, they might also be compliments, because people kind of like that. So, it's like, I'm so glad to get this chance to talk with you today. You're looking great. I've been looking forward to this. I have so much respect for you in terms of what you're doing, and I'd like to talk to you about. So you're buttering them up, but that works, okay? And it's not really insincere. Mm-hmm. It's not really disingenuous. So that's one way to do it. The other is then to be very congruent with that person. So when your verbal and nonverbal match up, they're more likely to really listen to you and hear you. Now, whether or not they're going to buy into what you're saying is another question. The other really important thing in terms of getting across the message is to use I language, because as soon as you start a sentence with you, people get defensive. Oh, because they expect they're going to hear something about them that they don't really want to hear, and that comes from when we're little. You're doing this, you're doing, and so that just comes with us as we grow older. And if you start with I, so I would like to talk with you about whatever it is, and you get buy-in from that person. Are you willing to talk with me about that? And they say, oh yeah, sure. Okay, so now you have buy-in, you have established a common ground that we actually going to talk about this together. Mm-hmm. If you just start with, I need to tell you about something, I don't need to hear it. I'm here. But if you say, I would like to speak with you about, after you've given them the big picture, much more effective way of getting your communication across.
Well, let's talk about understanding ourselves a little bit, because you talked about congruency of having your body language and your verbal language congruent, meaning connected and seemingly working together as opposed to being opposite one another and giving different impressions. So to be congruent, one has to understand themselves better than maybe most of us do. I mean, we all need to work on this. But as far as understanding ourselves, do we, in general, understand ourselves as well as we think we do? And if not, what keeps us from having a better understanding of our own thoughts and our own feelings and so forth?
Right, that's a great question. I think in general, we don't really know ourselves as well as we think we do. And the older we get, the more experience we have, I think sometimes we block out a lot of things. And a lot of that has to do with feeling defensive. So I don't really want to examine my own behavior because I'm me, I'm all right. So if I'm going to tell myself I'm okay, I need to not look at all the elements within that aren't really congruent, that aren't really hooked up that way. And I might have to say, yeah, you know, I'm saying something really nice to you, but I really don't mean it. And that's threatening. So I think it's hard for us to really know ourselves deeply because it's threatening to our ego, our sense of self. So yeah, I think we don't know, in general, people don't know themselves as well as they would like to think they do, but it's okay to think you do, because that's going to keep you going. You know what I mean? So it's okay. So you're not questioning yourself all the time, where you're accepting yourself as you are. It's a very good thing to do. I think in a lot, you know, our divorce rate's over 50%. Well, why is that? You know, people enter into a relationship without really knowing what it is that's motivating to do that.
And sometimes they do it multiple times. that could happen too.
Yeah, I'm on my number 4. Wait. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Right.
To follow up on what you're saying, we don't understand ourselves as well as we should, or we're not trying to understand ourselves maybe as well as we should in some cases. And obviously you need to have some confidence in how you feel, but at the same time, do we need to be aware of some self-denial that we might be carrying around with us? We only have about a minute, I think, till we get to the break.
One of our best answers in psychology is, it depends. Great answer. So it depends on the nature of the relationship. If you're in an employee-employer situation, you're going to act differently than if you're in a marital relationship. If you're talking to your kid, you're going to talk differently than if you're talking to your neighbor or to your spouse or to your employer or to your coworker. So it really depends on the circumstances of the situation.
No, I think that's good. There is some situationality, if you will, to all of our communications applications, and so I think it is going to be different what you say at work, perhaps, than what it would be at home if you're talking to the significant other. So I think we understand that. We have to go to the break right now.
Okay.
We'll pick this up again at the other side of the break, and stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk about more of what it means to really understand yourself and what it means to have inner peace, because that's an important component of this as well. Stay tuned.
Get involved. Become a leader in the well-being of our nation, actively lending your voice and energy to promote wellness. Be the voice for public education and health education in schools, community organizations, hospitals, and clinics. You can become part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Herb Glazeroff. Now, Herb, before we went to the break, we were talking about communication and whether we're being honest or whether there's some self-denial and those sorts of things. And you brought up a point during the break about the fact that, well, it kind of depends on who it is you're communicating with in terms of the trust level. If it's a long-time significant other, that's one thing. If it's a coworker in a cubicle you've only known for 6 months, it might be a little different. Why don't you expand on that a little bit, if you would? Right.
So we're talking about the self-denial. And if you're in an environment, a situation where the nature of the relationship is not very intimate and the impact of your behavior on the other and their behavior on you isn't going to be noticeable or impactful in any great way, and there's some denial involved, it's not going to matter that much. But if you're in a relationship with someone over time and you're relying on their continuing to be in a relationship and there's a lot of history shared and a lot of sense of intimacy between you, it's better not to be denying things. Because if that gets exposed, the issue of trust becomes very, very significant. And I never knew you felt that way. Well, now you know, right? Well, and then it can get into this heated, conflictual kind of interaction. So I think it's better to be able to lay it on the table. And one of the things that happens in relationships in the beginning is there is a honeymoon period. And there are a lot of things written that say we lie a lot in the beginning of a relationship. And you're like, what do you mean? I mean, well, you say, oh, you look great today, dear, or I really like that color on you. But things like that when you're like, oh, I don't really care. I want to think about the football game, but I'm going to say really nice things, and the other person then feels more connected. And so we go through this honeymoon period. And then down the road, well, I didn't really, I don't really care what color you wear, but you say you really, and so that kind of thing comes out. So it's not a bad thing, okay? Mm-hmm. But that in the beginning of relationships, there's a disingenuous part mm-hmm. that we might talk about, the denial of what we're really feeling. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in doing marital therapy, one partner will say, I never liked that dish that you make. Mm-hmm. I just said I liked it. Well, why would you say that? And so that kind of thing comes out down the road. As long as it's a little thing like what's being made for dinner, it's not a big deal. But if it has to do with some quality of the other person, some trait, personality trait, then it might be really a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we started on the self-denial or being in denial earlier, we were starting to talk about understanding ourselves. Mm. And I mentioned inner peace when we went to the break. And in order to have inner peace, you have to really understand yourself well. We've already talked about that. Mm-hmm. But inner peace would seem to be the key to more effective communication, because if you're in turmoil internally, mm-hmm. you don't really understand yourself. How can you expect others to be able to engage you and believe that you're sincere if it seems clear to them that you don't really understand yourself, or maybe they have observed that what you say is not aligned with your behavior. And so inner peace would seem to be the most important starting point. I know that there is a pioneer in family therapy, Virginia Satir, who talked a lot about this, about inner peace, and she had a famous motto or mantra that goes something like this: peace within, peace between, and peace among. So, but it starts with peace within. I know you've worked with family therapy and some of the techniques or some of the theories that Virginia has talked about. Mm-hmm. What about that? How do we know that we have inner peace, and what does it mean? Does it mean that we have self-acceptance? Does it mean that we understand what our weaknesses are and we accept that? Does it mean we've learned how to control our emotions? Does it mean that we're now in control of our control issues of trying to control and manipulate others? Or is it a combination of all of those things and more?
Yeah, I'll go for E on that one. It's a combination of all of those. Virginia was an amazing human being, very, very nurturing, very, very focused on wanting to help the people she worked with. And she has a book called People Making, which I would recommend for all families to read. So the inner peace, I think, is all of what you've said. It's a very complex thing. And it's coming to grips with who you are once you get to know who you are as best as you can do that. And saying, okay, yeah, sometimes I'm a jerk. And I'm willing to hear you tell me that because I know it, and I'm willing to admit it to you. And so I'm coming to grips with my own personal bugaboo, acknowledging it to you, and willing to deal with it. So there's an inner peace that has to do with that. I think it's really hard to understand and integrate, what we call integration, all of the things that have happened in our history. Because being a child is a very difficult thing to get through in a lot of families. And so there's a lot of self-denial, and there's a lot of having to go along with the societal norms, and you just have to go along with things, and you get along, and that's normal. It's a normal process. But if you're not aware of how something you're holding on to from an earlier experience, and something happens in your relationship as an adult, it's going to trigger that earlier experience, and some of that's going to come through. So the more you know that, and say, yeah, you know, that happened to me, but it's okay because I'm successful, I survived all of that, I have friends, I have a job, I feel love towards people, and I am loved. You know, my life is going along fairly well. Yes, I accept that that's it, and I've integrated it somehow into my sense of self. So yeah, I think that's a very, very important kind of thing, to have that inner peace, and it involves all the things you've mentioned.
And I think it is important, as you were just touching on there, that if you do have a difficult or troubled upbringing, you don't want that to ruin the rest of your life, if you will. You want to be able to get beyond that.
Yes.
And so how do people get beyond that? How do they get beyond a troubled upbringing?
Well, you go to psychotherapy. You engage with someone who's an effective therapist. And not just go to therapy, but go to someone who's an effective therapist. Someone where you feel you're really listened to, accepted for whom you are, they have compassion for you, and then you're going to be able to be more disclosing about what's going on with you. And what Virginia did, one of the things that Virginia Satir did in her workshops was recreate a family environment. So you would spend a week with her, and she would have someone in that group play the mother, play the father, play the sibling, play the significant people in your past. And you would go through an experience that you had when you were younger, only you now had nurturing, caring, supportive, compassionate people in your life in that moment that are very different than the ones you had when you were younger. So now you can have a different experience of that event. And what happens is our brain encodes those experiences. So what happened when we're younger is still there. We always have a neuronal pathway or an encoding or thought about, which is what memory is, but of what happened. So now you have the same event, only you have a very different outcome. And it's very, very powerful to go through this kind of thing, because you realize, like, maybe they were wrong. You know, maybe it wasn't my fault. Maybe I wasn't that bad a kid. Maybe they were having a bad day when they did that to me. And these people are saying, no, you're really okay. Of course you did. Yeah, you messed up. So what? You know, you're a good person. And so it's a very, very powerful way of overcoming things that have happened in your past. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move along to effective communication with a significant other, a spouse, for example, because that's also really important in our daily activities, because we talk to our significant others every single day. So there are some techniques that have been suggested. I'm going to run through these very quickly. This is kind of the lightning round here, and get your immediate reaction to these. First couple of tips: stay focused on the issue at hand. Don't relitigate the past with previous conflicts, and also listen carefully. Don't interrupt or get defensive, and repeat back what you've heard. What about that?
Excellent. I mean, it brings to mind when you mentioned that. I was working with a couple, and they came in, and they'd had an arranged marriage in another country. And they were both professionals, very successful, and she brought up something that was a problem. And I said, well, when did that happen? 14 years ago. So, you know, now we're dealing with something that's been sitting there, just eating at her. And other things of that nature had happened. So, yeah, you need to take care of things at the moment when they're happening, and be willing to communicate with the person about here and now, in the present, what's going on for me when you do that. It's very, very important. And stay with that. So there's this whole idea of the garbage can or the gunny sack. So when a little thing happens, you rather than deal with it, you put it in your gunny sack that you're carrying.
Right.
Because it's not that big a deal, really. And then something else happens, I'll put it in the gunny sack, because I don't want to make a big deal out of a little thing. And it goes on and on and on. So at some point, something happens. And it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. And you say, yeah, I'm done with it. And take the whole gunny sack and dump it. And all of a sudden, the other person says, where did all that come from? What are you talking about? We were just talking about this one thing about where we're going to dinner or what kind of movie. All of a sudden you're telling me about all the times I never listened to you and imposed my will, and it's overwhelming.
And there it is. In the interest of time, let's move on. Another one real quickly. Try to see or perceive the other's point of view and try to respond to criticism with empathy and sift through the emotions. So
Absolutely.
the gunny sack has been unloaded. I see the emotion. I want to sift through the emotion. How do I do that?
Yeah, empathy is very, very important in any kind of relationship that's going to work. So totally agree with that. And the empathic person is the one who can see it, stand a while in my shoes, see why it is I think that way, what it is I'm feeling, why I'm feeling that way. Because then there's no judgment. I'm understanding you, and I might have compassion. Of course that's going to be upsetting to you. Not to me or someone else, but to you, yes, I understand. So empathy is a very, very critical element to any kind of positive relationship.
Herb, unfortunately our time is running very thin here, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds. How do we make this process empowering as opposed to draining? Because we're dealing with a lot of things here. We're dealing with high emotion when we're talking to a significant other who has some issues. High emotion, we're talking about controlling our own temper or controlling our own emotions. We're talking about being empathetic. How do we do that so that it's empowering and not draining? Again, only 30 seconds.
Okay, you make a commitment to it. That's the key. And whenever you're going to relate to someone else, you get buy-in to they're also committed to the process. And it is an ongoing process, and you know at the end, you're going to feel better, your relationship will be better.
Okay, and on that note, we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion, but thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure being here. I had a great time.
Okay, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.